our critical theory lecture series. Some of you probably have been to this series more than I have, since this is my first evening of the series. Sorry to say. Can you hear me okay back there? A little more? In the back? Good? Better? Okay, thank you, Sharon. So this was just a great idea that Susan had here in the beginning, to really draw from the expertise we've got across the faculty here for an overview of some of the basic areas of critical theory that you're encountering in your own studies and scholarship. It's very humbling to be included in this series, I have to say. There's some intellectual giants in this series that I wish I'd been here to see. I'm doubly humbled because since I took on this invitation to deliver this presentation, I've also taken on an associate deanship. And so my head's not been in theory as much as maybe even I'd want. So it's humbling to kind of step back into it, but I'm really grateful to be here. Thankfully, the bar, I think, is kind of low because digital humanities are not critical theory. So at least there's that. And that's some of what I'm going to be focusing on tonight. I should say a little bit about my location on the campus for those of you who have not met before. So my home appointment is in the School of Art and Design. I come from a fine arts practice background. So I've been here since 2002, teaching a lot of interaction design courses, new media art courses, really coming from the making side of things. Over the years, especially as I've watched digital humanities kind of come into our space, I've been working more and more with scholars, both as a researcher myself and as a teacher, to try to engage some of my experience with digital media in the realm of scholarship. And these days, my work to that end is mostly through the College of Fine and Applied Arts, where I work in the Office of the Dean, on the research side of the house there, helping support our faculty to get funding for their work. But I also have done some work for the Illinois Program for Research in Humanities over the years here, helping them kind of bridge this gap in digital humanities as well. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. In a moment, I'm going to briefly survey some of the practices that fall under digital humanities, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on examples of projects today. I've done that in other presentations, and I'm going to at least try to point you to where you can find some more. But I didn't think that was quite appropriate to this talk. I think really what seemed more appropriate was to spend some time on the question of why this particular collection of practices hang out under this banner of digital humanities. It is a very vexing topic for us in the academy. It's not a discipline, it's not a theory. What are the digital humanities? I think if we're going to have digital humanities as part of a critical theory series, we need to theorize a bit about why it even is a collection of things. And so that's partly what I'm going to focus on tonight. So my talk's going to be what I would call kind of T-shaped. It'll be really broad at the beginning to kind of get an overview of some of the field, and then dive way in on one particular genealogy that I think could be helpful to this question of digital humanities coherence, and if there is one. And just for a little preview, that deep dive for me is going to be a bit into the history of human-computer interaction and with a sort of touch of science and technology studies. It's not the only genealogy one might draw from for this kind of occasion, but it's the one I found most useful. So my question to that end for tonight and the big picture will be, do the digital humanities assume a specific kind of user? And by user, that may be a word that's new to you. This is a word coming from human-computer interaction, and I think it's an apt one to use, as opposed to scholar, or student, or teacher. But we'll see more about that. So first, on the broad part of the T-shape, what is DH? One of the best ways you can start to answer that for yourself, because it's constantly changing, is just to go look and see where it's happening. And to that end, I point you to a few things. There's now a couple of main organizations here. The ADHO and Haystack are two of the big organizations and consortiums of different networks of digital humanities practitioners and researchers. So you could go to those organizations and look and see what they're saying DH is. They both have conferences. Haystack has an annual conference. The ADHO has an annual conference, but they're also a consortium of other networks that have their own conferences, and it's actually quite global, which is getting, I think, especially interesting at this point. So you can now find a robust digital humanities network in Mexico, in Central America, for example. So there's networks within networks here. DHQ, which is the journal that the ADHO runs, and from which I pulled an article for tonight's reading that I'll be addressing briefly. There's another kind of net site you can check, Digital Humanities Now, but really the best way to ask what is DH is to follow the money. The big movers here are Mellon, MacArthur, and the NEH. And the NEH's specific office here is the Office of Digital Humanities. And as my colleague Ted put it much more eloquently last week when the chair of NEH was here, if you look back at the list of projects that were funded through the Office of Digital Humanities in the 7, 8 years they've been doing this now, you'll see DH forming. You'll see a lot of different kinds of projects. It's a great way to learn about what's happening there. So each of these organizations kind of has a different horse in the race. MacArthur, I think, is a little more engaged in the learning side, Mellon more on the publishing side. I'm not going to get a lot into the specific projects, but if you want to learn more about what DH is after today's talk, start with some of those places. Again, I'm trying to think about you, imagining many of you as early in your careers and looking to see where you might want to go. So let's break this open a little bit. Right? So this is what most people would say DH is. It's the realm of books plus a computer, right? I mean, that's the first thing. It's what we do as scholars, but now there's computer involved. Let me break that up into some separate piles here for a bit, just as a kind of overview. Again, I'm in the T part of the talk of what DH has been. Again, I'm not naming specific projects, but let's look at some taxonomies. It's getting into dangerous territory. I'm gonna call out some different areas that overlap, that you'll disagree with. Some of you might find yourself reeling at the description of, but I'm gonna try to do my best to sort of give an overview of some different sections of work that happens under this crazy assortment of practices. So first we might look at the area of humanities computing, an aspect of DH that was really one of the first ones that landed here on this campus. And the humanities computing is largely about the question of what can you say about large collections of texts with the aid of computational analysis. So you're looking at extremely large collection of texts, digitized texts, that would have taken many a monastery of scholars in earlier days to parse through. And employing different kinds of software processes to see what you can say about, say, trends in plot or trends in character across massive thousands of texts. This is an area where you might come across concepts such as distant reading, the idea that maybe there's something to be read about a corpus of texts that you can say about all of them, as opposed to the kind of hermeneutics we're used to in scholarship of the close reading of a single text. You might come across, I'll just name a few names for each one of these. This is not an attempt to name canon, but a kind of shout out if you're looking to learn more about this, where would you go? These are some of the folks you might look at here. Manovich, Moretti, Unsworth, who was here, of course, Ramsey. And some folks are also engaged not only in computational analysis of lots of texts, but in the formation of texts into structures that can be computed, right? So we might not just be crunching a bunch of books, but maybe, as in the text encoding initiative, you're primarily about the process of figuring out how might you take a text and introduce new kinds of tags into it to describe that text in a way that a software program can understand. And sometimes just coming up with standards in that area is a digital humanities project. Another big pile here. We might look at the area of interactive archives. This is another big set of digital humanities projects. Scholars who are interested in what happens when you provide for the scholar or for the public a new way of accessing a collection of documents, maps, artifacts of some kind. Oftentimes, you might think about this as being a place where you might see interactive maps. For example, some of the earliest and most influential DH projects in this area would be the kind of maps that you can sort of roll over, take in the ubiquity of something like Google Maps, for example, as an inspiration to say, what if we could look at a corpus of text according to the city in which they were written in? What might that afford as a new kind of analysis of those texts? So a lot of digital humanists are just about making these archives. Sometimes they're map kind of interfaces. Sometimes this is about new ways of accessing video, for example. A few names I would call out here would be people like Tara McPherson, who was here last year, I believe, if not the year before. Dan Cohen from the Digital Public Library of America, Roy Rosenwig, and Todd Presner. So folks who are trying to think about maybe scholars could make archives as arguments, kind of way of summarizing this area. Again, loose taxonomies here, overlapping taxonomies. There's another area we might look at in DH with the folks who are primarily thinking about this as a way of rethinking what writing is and what distribution is. These are folks who are asking questions about how is the task of writing even the most traditional scholarly monograph different for the fact that we use Word to do it? How is the writing process different than it used to be? What do people imagine that they're doing when they're copying and pasting, or when they're quickly citing things they see on Twitter as part of a writing experience, when it becomes a more networked writing experience? What's a collectively authored monograph look like, written in Google Docs, and how is that different from previous kinds of writing practices? I would kind of include in this pile the folks who are also thinking about the distribution end and rethinking academic publishing. What might happen not only in terms of what's available as a writing space, but as a distribution space, getting people new ways of getting contact with scholarly arguments in a lot of different kinds of forms. So somebody like Kathleen Fitzpatrick, for example, who was here a few years ago, has written a lot about, well, maybe it might make sense for the scholarly argument to just come out in little blips and bloops here, instead of waiting for the article or waiting for even the monograph to be finished. Maybe you've got what you wrote today, and you post that out there, and you see what takes, and you see what feedback you get. Maybe that has implications for whether or not we even need scholarly monographs anymore at all. These are the kind of questions that folks are asking on the publishing side of this piece of that sort of section here. So rethinking writing and distribution. Folks like Matthew Kirschenbaum, Wendy Chun are looking at the process of writing itself and how it's changed over the years. We might even call out this is kind of analog to something that might have happened in the Walter Ong, Marshall McLuhan kind of area of looking at the different move from orality to literacy. Maybe this is another step. What kind of writing, what kind of literacies are happening here? A couple more. There's another whole area of digital humanities I think that are primarily interested in teaching and pedagogy. They're primarily interested in how, as writers, as researchers, as teachers, these technologies begin to reimagine the learning environment itself. This has been a big part of why, for example, the MacArthur Foundation is involved in this, and Kathy Davidson, as one of the founding folks of Haystack, along with David Theo Goldsberg and Ann Balsamo, have really brought a lot of interesting perspectives and arguments about what teaching can be now that it begins to incorporate more modes of composition. So those of you who are in classes or as teachers, having your students editing video at the same time that they're writing arguments in text, begin to perhaps find a home in the arguments happening on this side of the digital humanities. And a couple more yet. Some digital humanists would say, oh, what do digital humanists do? They make tools. So not all these folks even really know each other. And I'll get to this again. This is how, I hope you'll get a sense here of just how broad this area is. Some folks would just say the job of the digital humanist is to make a new tool for one of those other folks to use. And that if you've made a new way to parse a text, written a new program to parse a text, you've done your job as a digital humanist. Before you even tried to make arguments about that text with that tool. Folks like Gentry Sayers, for example, are trying to find ways to get actual hardware, like working with Arduinos and interactive sensors and actuators, into the process of doing work on 19th century English literature. Like, I'll just leave that to your imagination, but Gentry is trying to come up with kind of Maker Lab infused, kind of hacking aesthetic modes of teaching literature in the classroom. So there's some really interesting spaces going on there. And lastly, this is a bit of a catch-all and also none of these are fair, but again, I'm just trying to give a kind of some entry points here. There's a whole area of digital humanities, which I think would be the one I most identify with actually, and that'll probably become clear, which I would call the kind of meta-scholarly side of digital humanities. The folks who are using all these other practices and the technologies that are at their hands to ask questions about every aspect of what scholarship and institutions are today. So you get folks saying, well, if all those other things are going on, then maybe we're not just producing tomorrow's professors, maybe we're producing other kinds of knowledge workers in our PhD programs. Or they're asking things like, what kind of labor practices are coming out because of these new processes and techniques, and are people really getting trained in them well, asking questions about who's doing this work, the role of race and class and gender, and which work gets valued and not. And I would say this is a really interesting area because some of it is seizing on the other areas and saying, hey, what's that? And others in this pile, I would say, are the people who are saying, you know, these technologies actually enable us to make visible things we never were able to make visible before about scholarly life. And that's where they gravitate to technology. It's like a networked, collective conversation about what's going on in the classroom is a new possibility that affords new sort of meta critiques about the state of education itself. And just a few names there for your reference later, including Joanna Dripper, that I'll say a bit about. So if that's just sort of a little bit of a move through that T-shaped part of this talk, again, really broad. I want to say again, other talks where I show examples, I just didn't think that was the right call for this talk because I don't want to open this up for you all as like a set of practices that you would sort of uncritically go off and follow. I want to present this as an array of possibilities that I would hope we'd have a collective conversation about why we want to engage them as a community. A couple more things about this. There's a weird thing about DH projects that I've heard Ted talk a lot about as well, which is that the same project can look very different presented in its disciplinary home compared to presented in other DH projects. So let's say a humanities computing project where you're doing a large-scale analysis of plot trends across a lot of novels. When you present it in the literature conference, that's your academic home, you can have a conversation with the folks who aren't using computing about your thesis. You have a conversation about what's going on with that, with your argument, with your hypotheses, learning more about the text together. But when you get a bunch of humanities computing folks together, it often becomes more about the sort of meta-reflective conversation about the state of scholarship today. And so the same project can look very different in different spaces. And the result of that is that often I find that digital humanities conferences or the digital humanities panel at one of your traditional conferences is the most self-referential space in the whole academia, because we're just asking questions about every single aspect of academia and saying, is this what we want to do? Is this where we want to be? And that's just an interesting piece of this in that context, and it's one I want to hone in on because I think DH offers us not just a set of new interfaces, but a set of possible questions about where we want to institutionally ally ourselves or present ourselves. Let me say a little bit about critiques of DH before I kind of go into some genealogies of this that I hope will be helpful. Again, I'm really making like drive-bys on this. These are quick. What kind of critiques might you encounter, for example, of the humanities computing side of things? Well, you might, for example, hear critiques about this that, well, I'll grab for an easy target. Stanley Fish is probably predictably crabby about this area of work. Published a couple of New York Times pieces where he said, these are fishing expeditions. These are people just hitting randomize and seeing what comes up next from the data, and then finding an argument somewhere in there. And this is such a technocratic hermeneutic here. Like you're letting the interpretive mechanisms from science pollute the humanities in a way that you're not actually able to get in touch with the arguments here. And to be fair, sometimes these are easy targets. I just wanted to single out one. Len Manovich tweet from the other day. Don't start with a research question. Instead, map big data from culture first, which I just think is horrible advice. And I gotta say, one of the best critics, one of the best answers to these often straw man criticisms that you can find will be, I'm just going to keep calling out Ted. Ted Underwood has some really great responses to this particular criticism on the side of the house. And I'm not going to get into that, but I just want to let you know what are some of those critiques and said a bit about that. The critiques of this side that I've come across, and if we were in a class context, I could point you to some articles here, but I just want to be quick. Critiques of this side of DH is that sometimes there's too much archives over argument. Where is the actual scholarly argument in the construction of a bunch of scanned media artifacts? We might sometimes also find some critiques of this area from archivists. I've certainly been called on this, and I think rightly. This is an area that I've done some work in, and I'm throwing up one video clip and scan document after another into the archives that I'm working with, and not always with the best metadata that my good information science folks would like, and maybe if I was working as part of an infrastructure and not a solo practitioner, I might do a little more justice to those objects. So, I mean, that's a criticism I've encountered of my own work in that area. One of the criticisms of this area is that some of the emphasis on, especially on distribution, the sort of harshest kind of anti-monograph arguments, of which I think we see less and less actually, are just throwing things out in a too utopian a way. The argument for them, there's lots of strong arguments to make for the scholarly monograph still, I would say. And so where these go to the end of let's just publish everything we write all the time, that would be where you sort of find some criticisms there. Some of the criticisms of the sort of teaching and pedagogy side sometimes are around this question of, are we creating digital serfs more than digital citizens by the ways we're kind of including students in all these new network platforms as part of our scholarly learning environment. Sometimes the critics you might hear of the sort of tool side of things would be that maybe there's not always a lot of knowledge here from the perspective of someone like Mike Twidell, who has studied how people adopt tools. And if you get a big grant to adopt a tool, you probably better learn a little first about how people use tools and whether or not they're really going to use it. So again, just want to orient this to what you might come across in these areas. In the metacritical kind of area of these things, I think some of the criticisms I've encountered in this area would be that there sometimes would be accused of, say, believing too much in the potential of the network as a space of a sort of a liberatory potential, or sometimes in these cases, I've seen folks say, well, some of that great critical work you're doing of the academy, and then in the digital humanities area, would really have a better home here in gender and women's studies, or sort of, in what we might call the place where those critiques emerge. We could do that work better together. Again, there's just some things you might hear. Some broader ones. A lot of people would ask, does DH really merit its own conference journal, et cetera? What's about the rest of the humanities? Are the analog humanities? Is it the non-digital? What happens here in terms of that divide? This is one that really interests me. Is the only thing that makes this stuff cohere the fact that it's so legible because of its emphasis on the technical in a context like this university, for example. This is raising questions about not is coherence bad or good, but is this the kind of coherence, even in the support of good projects, that we really want to have around? And another couple of interesting ones here, I think this idea that DH pushes institutional risk to the institutionally vulnerable. So pushing the edge of experimentation to grad students, new faculty, women and people of color who might be seen as more likely to adopt these kind of practices in the name of a vanguard, but maybe don't have the protection of tenure, for example, in terms of that experimentation within their own discipline. So I think there's some good critiques in that area as well. But again, I don't want to focus on this just to sort of introduce you to some of what you might encounter in terms of practices and critiques. But the real question I think would be most useful to think about tonight would be how we might theorize this whole set of practices and critiques. And the reason why I think it's useful to theorize is not just because we're at the unit tonight, but because we need to understand, again, what our community's relationships to these practices are. What do we want to invest in terms of resources in these practices? How do we want to incorporate them as career paths, these sorts of things? And one thing that really struck me in preparing for this talk is that looking at this broad set at once of both technical possibilities, institutional possibilities, social possibilities, DH starts to look to me a lot like a kind of modular, reconfigurable system that invites users rather than participants. Is what sort of look to me at this point. Let me give you a kind of example. This is hopefully not going to parody, but this is the way I start to think about DH, is that you can imagine a kind of drop-down menu system for constructing your DH project, where the first thing you do is you choose the digital component. Do you want to focus on the network piece, do you want to focus on the interactive piece, the computation piece? And then maybe you pick your scholarly component. Are you looking more at the act of reading or the act of writing or the act of publishing? Like which part of existing humanities scholarship do you want to look at? And then you say, oh, okay, now I've got to figure out my corpus let's look at images for this one. And then what about my institutional location? Do I want to present this in DH, or do I want to present this in my home discipline, or want to do this public engagement project? And then, oh yeah, I gotta get which theory am I going to use? And I mean, it's a modular kind of set of possibilities here, and then you end up with your project will be a post-colonial network image. I mean, there's a way that it's when again I'm trying to think about the perspective here of the grad student, looking at this as like, where am I going to go in, and what's worth my time, and what's happening here. It starts to feel really this kind of system here that gives me some pause for an occasion like this. And it's a pause I haven't always employed, I have to say, in my presentations about DH and IPRH kind of space. One way of asking this is, why does engaging DH feel a little like choosing an operating system, or a smartphone, or a cable provider, or a bank? It can feel like this kind of set of decisions where you can't really win, and it's hard to find the agency in there, and even as a group, you're trying to figure this out. And maybe the reason why is because human factors. And this is my premise tonight. Maybe the history of human factors, of human-computer interaction is relevant here, not only because of the technical, but because of the organizational. And that's what I want to dive into the T part of the talk with a lot of caveats here, that I'm getting into some genealogies of digital humanities that you could go a lot of different genealogies here, and many people have. I would point you to them and encourage you to go to them. I'm relying on more of a human-computer interaction genealogy here because it's partly what makes sense to me. It's partly my background. But I think there's a lot of ways you could go. I want to start here, though, with a little pause to look at a video that I think helps make some sense of this for me. So I'm going to go over here to show just a few minutes of a demo video that Apple made in the 80s for something called the Knowledge Navigator. It's a video where Apple's trying to imagine what the year 2006 or 7 might look like. And it's very interesting. They pick a scholar for their user. Really crappy resolution. Sorry, it's just old.
In 1923, Lon Chaney's brilliant characterization of Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame played on the audience's tendency to stereotype, to prejudge individuals according to their appearance, rather than understand them for who they really were. So, dictate. It's been nearly a century since The Hunchback of Notre Dame horrified audiences in silent movie houses. But have attitudes changed much in 95 years? Or do we still judge far too quickly the content by the cover? Here. Show me writer's block.
The current project is untitled. To continue, you may wish to review your outline, explore the suggestion box, or view great writers' methods. Sometimes a short break helps to stimulate ideas. Perhaps you enjoy a pleasant walk.
No, it's not that bad yet. Show me the outline.
Your next heading is Technology's Impact on Attitudes Toward People with Disabilities. The subheading is The Catalyst for Change.
Okay, I need some examples. Where can we go for information about how attitudes and expectations have changed toward people with disability in the last, say, 15 or 20 years?
I have a list of consultants who provide data excerpts in related areas. There is also a media index called Capabilities Enhancement.
Good, show me the index, hold the list. Didn't you guys just finish an entire box of cookies?
Mom, The science that makes you hungry. Besides, it wasn't entire bite. You had some too.
One, I had one. Well, maybe two. Honey, it's too early for dinner. I'm working against the deadline. Can you wait about an hour?
Maybe.
The lonely, unappreciated scientific genius forges on, despite enormous odds.
Right. Happy 14. Bye.
Okay, so much for the hydrogen iodide. One more unit and we're done.
Now, wait a second. What do you think would happen if we use chlorine with this?
So this goes on another several minutes, and it's just, to me, it's notable that Apple at that time chose the scholar as their ideal user. From this, and there's another video that features a male scholar who's a scientist in this case, rather than the media scholar, and with different kinds of interruptions than the domestic ones. There's lots you can say about this particular video, but they are spec videos. They're videos that Apple made to try to imagine future products. They could give those to the engineers and say, we need these features, and what happens next. And to me, that's a kind of clue to thinking through these histories a bit. So this is the part of the talk where I'm going to go deep down into the tea for about 20 minutes here, and then we'll come back out and talk. But I think that it could be really helpful to sort of see how we got from Taylorism to perhaps to DH, if not at least to a kind of prototype video like that, as a way of understanding the set of possibilities that we're presented with. And here, because I'm getting into some history, I'm going to do a little more reading because I want to get it right but get it short. So each era and place, as y'all know, has its figure of an ideal laborer. Let me get this a little darker so you can see these pictures. That's better. Thanks. Sorry, I didn't want that to go. Interface problems. We'll get it back up in a little bit. Only now it's too dark for me to see. All right, now we're into high tech here. I think this was what. There we go. Oh, I love that. There you go. Great. So you think about your ideal laborer, right? Every era's got one. And for the first part of the 20th century in America, that figure, as many of you know, was the Taylorist laborer, whose actions were counted and measured for ultimate efficiency. So in this approach, each person performed exactly the tasks their bodies were deemed able to perform in the allotted time for the desired ends. The Taylorist worker is a specialized and sorted cog, recruited for work in a hierarchical machine based on how each race or gendered body fit the needs of the hand. Now, as many of you know, the sheer size of labor demand in the Second World War changed that approach. Workers ended up working in any position that they could find for the purposes of the greater good for a little while. And though after the war, many went back to their gender and race designated positions in the workforce, after the war, the figure of an ideal worker had changed. The designers of work and work environments after the war began to think less about suiting the laborer to the work and more about suiting the work to the laborer. This is a change I'm going to be talking in depth here about. This started with the design of pilots, design of cockpits for pilots, but it extended to the rest of labor as well. And it's a new approach that was born of human factors and eventually ergonomics. So where Taylorism, as in this photograph here, and scientific management applied a close lens to the human form, studying and designing around its every need and variation in the interest of efficiency, least possible movements to fold a napkin. The new view approached the worker as merely one component within a system of material and informational flows. There's an expansion here, where the worker of the early 20th century could be described as a collection of motions implemented through learned behaviors. The post-war worker, and I'll say more about this image here in a bit, adds to that collection of behaviors an assortment of decision-making routines. Kind of big the head guy. More than a mere repeater of actions, the new worker not only acts but perceives, makes decisions based on sensory input, acting according to learned evaluative routines that correlate sensation to action. The new worker possesses eyes and ears, in addition to hands and feet. So late in the war, a handful of military research facilities, staffed primarily by experimental psychologists, had started testing human physical and perceptual limits to this end. In a 1954 paper called The Information Capacity of the Human Motor System in Controlling the Amplitude of Movement, Paul Fitz at Ohio State devised a way to approach operators' movements as quantifiable, mathematically analyzable actions, namely by timing a pilot's pointing actions and comparing the durations of those actions to the size of the target. And this developed something called Fitz's law, which is a kind of calculus that's still designed for constructing our interfaces. And the key here is that once an operator's actions can be not only counted in time, but measured and calculated like math, I think the labor looks a lot less like the human version of gears and levers in industrial technology, and labor begins to look more like the mathematics that govern and course through those technologies. So here, Vannevar Bush's proto-computer here, the differential analyzer, is a good thing to think about. And this device is an early computer that's pre-digital because it's actually a collection of gears and axles that you've got to set on the machine before it can actually do its work. And the post-war laborer looks not dissimilar to that arrangement because he or she is not a man of a particular physical build, but a collection of these universalized possible movements that are selected according to mathematical principles in order to serve as a control in a system. I'm going to talk more about this control idea. So key to this approach was information theory and cybernetics. So Claude Shannon's work, along with Norbert Wiener's work, found its way into these experimental psychology labs. And because in computing at the time, the understanding of signals as information had paved the way for the establishment of binary code, in which the course of electrons through gates and switches in a machine could be translated into algorithms and mathematical functions. And that's really where software was born, this kind of information analysis at the electronic level. And many who found behaviorism at the time inadequate to explaining or modifying human behavior saw these information-based approaches echoes of the structure of the human brain. So a lot of these folks, when they start marrying information theory to understanding of cognition, they begin to think about the brain as a kind of machine. Perhaps thought and decision-making might be understood as a kind of algorithm performing consistent functions on ever-changing sense data, zipping through the brain's neural pathways, the way electrons course through copper circuits. And so from here, a new understanding of the operator's actions emerged alongside a new understanding of computers' routines. People started thinking about human actions as math, and at the same time, the sort of electronic behavior of computation as math. And the first software thus emerged at the same time that human thought and memory began to be analyzed as a collection of mathematical functions. So what strikes me in this is that you've got two black boxes born at the same moment. The black box, the beginning of understanding of the human mind as the black box of routines, and the establishment of a computational machine as a collection of routines. So before that post-war moment, systems of manufacturing and control were designed to include the human body as the control in an operational sense. And what a control in an operational sense does is like a limiter or a governor. Controls provide brackets to acceptable inputs and outputs in a machine. If the control in a Tayloristic system slows her work, the whole process slows, as labor is well aware, right? And that's where these war strikes can come from. But in the post-Taylorist workflow, the control is not performed by the person. The machine is not as fast as the person is. In the new era, the machine is as fast as the software tells it to be, in the black box inside the machine. So the new computers allowed for the programming of those internal black boxes within the machine itself. And all kind of sensors even drove data into those processes. So you start to think maybe the human's gone, maybe the machine is becoming self-contained. However, he or she is not really missing from this scene entirely, as science fiction also attests. There's a little montage here of images that fascinate me from this time. And the operator, I think, now performs a function as a control for the control. If there's a set of routines telling the machine its capacities within which to perform, the machine now affords new indications to the operator, the human operator, the proper functioning of that software-based controller, the black box. deviations from designated functions trigger new actions from the operator. New sounds happen, new images, even symbolic information comes out to the human operator that says the software-based control process needs attention now. And though operating from a more distance in relationship to machines than the Tayloristic laborer, the operator plays no less critical a role. The systems over which she watches are just more complex than they were before. Her role is more tied to error detection and to actuation, pulling levers. And this is in part because statistically, these larger systems were more error prone, so they needed this kind of watcher. So as the operator's mental routines have to be just as carefully scripted as the Taylorist's manual routines, labor practices end up coded according to advanced knowledge of perception and thought, via, again, understanding of the brain as a computer. So there's a new operator here that is less of the system, even though she is made more in the image of that system based on the understanding of the brain as a kind of computer. Formerly, she was one organ within a mechanical body, as a Taylorist laborer. But now she's modeled as a discrete body herself, tethered to another mechanical body that she's also modeled after for the purposes of safe and consistent flow. So the machine and the operator mirror one another in this moment, with the interface as the crucial site of division, the glass of reflection and action. So we're getting to interface, and in a minute we'll get to organization. And I think these two things are key for understanding, I think, why we have DH as we have today. I want to read a quote from John Harwood about interfaces. He says, "The interface of this moment in human factors history is located neither in the body or the machine. It's between the two centers. And likewise, it's also nonsense to assume that the body's former primary status in the economies of work have been supplanted by the machine. Rather, the ergonomic interface is the product of the designer or designers who construct the interaction between the two as a full-fledged single subject, defined by the abstracted and coordinated limitations of machine and body alike." This interface is a really crucial divide at this moment. It's a crucial divide in the system because both agents in the system, the controller and the computer, have transformed. They're transformed in a way that foregrounds the exchange between agents over the synthesis of agents that Taylorism demanded. Both are now capable of processing, and so both now require input, not only of signals, but parameters for governing those signals. And the interface is how those things course back and forth. So, and these changes begin to affect the sociality as well. Because now we need a new entity to help keep all these agents working together, and that's the organization that emerges at this moment, which invites design at the complex level that in a way that accounts for multiple machinic and human actors. So you black box the control mechanisms of the computer, you've got a human sort of modeled after computational processes governing that system, but now you've got to figure out how to black box all those black boxes. You've got to figure out how to get them all interacting as well. I'm going to say a word about where this comes out. This is going to take us to Apple in a minute. So where each machine used to come with an operator as a controller. That's the way what a computer used to be. You get a machine and a person that would come together. The two are treated as a single entity. The post-war machine comes with the operator as an agent who's necessary to the function of the machine, but separate from it. So there's an organization that's now a plurality of entities. And they're not mere aggregations, as in the Taylor's sense, where there's a sort of aggregation of individual user machines. The organization is trying to get them to be working together. And so some of the biggest moves, such as Plato here on our campus in the latter half of the 20th century, were about how to get from a mere aggregation of operators to a synthesized network of workers. An interesting figure here is J.C.R. Licklider, known as Lick, who in the 1960s started to, for the first time since the sort of 19th century human computer brigades, started to make changes in computing to get this stuff to work as an organized human system. So the earliest electric computers, you would just work on a single problem. You just sort of put in one problem and you wait till it came out the other end. And there wasn't much possibility for interrupting the process as it was going, or for multiple problems to get operated on at the same time. And that was the problem that Licklider wanted to work on. Licklider, incidentally, was working at Harvard in the basement opposite the behaviorists, and he really didn't like how they were thinking about human behavior. So he started trying to figure out a way to help think about human behavior through information theory and Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener's ideas about cognition. And he later began to be exposed to some of these information theories even more through his work on Air Force's SAGE radar project. And so he began to wonder how a computer might be made more useful through the facilitation of multiple simultaneous users all making changes at the same time. And the way he ended up thinking about this was, he ended up thinking about the computational process and the human interaction with it in a way that would enable something that's radical at the time, a command line interface, where you actually have a screen where you could enter in a command. And the reason for that was to get it working on multiple problems, but also to get multiple people working on the same thing. So from Licklider's frame, users from multiple points in a space could make simultaneous requests of the same computational processor for the first time and receive instant feedback on that, on the status of their computational requests. The only way this was possible was because of software, and a whole new conception of software, where you began to think about information in terms of chunks that could then be analyzed as these little tiny black boxes, and the black boxes moving around, coursing through these different software processes that govern that information. So the innovation that Licklider introduced was structural at the computing level. It was epistemological, because now you have real-time feedback about mathematical processes you want the machine to do. And it eventually is social as well. In order to get a computer working on multiple problems at the same time, you had to make a social change. You had to reconceive all the users as part of a single organization, part of a single social unit. And so it's no accident that people like Ted Nelson, who in the Whole Earth Catalog and publications like Computer Lib were in the very early stages of the personal computing revolution, when they were advocating for how computing was going to change things, they were pointing to Licklider's work on multitasking as a key to the liberatory potential of computing. So you end up with some really interesting histories here from these kind of spaces that Fred Turner has written about, for example. So Ted Nelson, who was really latching on to Licklider's work on sort of multitasking and a sort of network social computer workforce, would go on to invent the idea of hypertext with a group of others as well. And I think you can even follow that sort of line of innovation and exploration that Licklider was on to places like Xerox PARC, where the Macintosh computer graphical interface emerged. And so throughout the work of these early steps in personal computing, I think we find a rhetoric of liberation and political empowerment that's really made possible by the black boxing of the human mind, as well as the software processes that people were interacting with. So there's a lineage here that I think really bears some examination in light of the set of possibilities we have about why we get both social opportunities, institutional opportunities, and interface opportunities at the same time with an area like DH. I want to end with a couple of alternatives. I want to end with a couple of spaces where I've found other ways of framing this. Because for me, if DH is just a modular set of possibilities, it's not one I want to engage in. I want to find another way of engaging these things. And so I called out Joanna Drucker's work as one avenue into these. There's many others. Drucker is drawing, as many others, especially in that sort of metacritical side of DH, have from the work of Lucy Suchman. And I just want to say a little bit about Suchman's work and Drucker's work, and then end with a word about play. So Lucy Suchman, through her early work in the 1980s as an anthropologist, offered a significant rejoinder to the evolution of design that I just went through. She was actually in residence at Xerox PARC, that place where many of these processes were being innovated into a mass consumption kind of technology. And what she was studying there was something we all struggle with, which is how to use a Xerox machine. Lucy Suchman took an anthropologist's eye to what Xerox thought people were doing with that interface. And she was studying what do people do when it breaks, the active following instructions that the provider gave, and what happens there. And she started making observations that are probably obvious to many of you looking at this history, because she's drawing from phenomenology, sociology, feminist theory, and she starts building a case for the necessity of understanding human interaction with machines beyond the mathematics of cognitive processing. And starts calling for a different hermeneutic for understanding these relationships that doesn't just assume preformed plans. We don't anymore know what we're about to do before we go push the button. Then we know what we're trying to achieve by the speech act or by the physiological act. Intention happens in action. is the sort of basics here. Intelligibility happens on site, is Suchman's revolutionary perspective, which may seem crazy that that's revolutionary, but she's calling attention to the life of the whole body in an interactive scenario, and that if you want to understand creating productive, even optimized relationships here, you've got to look at that whole picture. She launched a whole wave of new ethnography in design. The field of design is profoundly different for this, and it's a reset of that whole history that I put on here. And she went on to conduct other great scholarship that argues, for example, for the importance of studying representations of work to designing for work. She makes a compelling case for that. She talks about how, even when talking about what makes an innovation center happen, you need to look more at place. She's building from a kind of innovation and intervention into the human factors history to come up with this great whole set of apparatus for understanding possibilities technology affords us socially, epistemologically, politically. And in short, she throws out all these things in favor of a new multidisciplinary approach that seeks to understand and design for human lives with machines by accounting for the collective as well as individual identities here, and accounting for bodies as well as minds. She's been a huge influence in a lot of who I count to be some of the best voices in DH, the ones I've learned the most from. Joanna Drucker is one of those voices, and I singled out two of her articles for this week. And in the 2013 article that I selected it because she is calling out some of these histories that we could have done besides the one that I've gone through today as well. And she builds on Suchman's work and other work to call for a return to understanding of scholarly work that draws more on speech, orality, and performance than on information, translation, and transfer. This is where I think Drucker is really helpful. And materiality for Drucker matters because acts in reading and interpretation happen in bodies, take place in bodies through mediation, not in some abstract space. I see Drucker as looking for better interfaces, but I don't think she sees interfaces as inherently machinic or digital or even textual. For her, the book is an interface, as I suspect it is the classroom for her, even the peer-reviewed article, the symposium talk. And I think for Drucker, interface is a useful metaphor because it emphasizes that meeting of the two that human factors has put us back to over time and time again, but with new epistemological foundations. One can imagine through Suchman's work that encounter never happens the same way twice. There's a richer understanding of reading that's familiar to you if you read books. You know it's not always the same. The human factors is not going to help us much with the acts of hermeneutics and close reading that happen. So Drucker's calling for us to look at the book as an interface, and she does it. I mean, this book, Her Thesis, is a beautiful little book Harvard University Press put out, where she designed the whole book as well as the argument in it in a way that I think really manifests this. And it's not just to dress up an old technology in new terms to call a book an interface. I think she's calling for new forms of reading, right? She's calling for forms of reading that could be assisted by other technologies, that could be aggregated through social networks, interspersed through our days across all these devices and platforms we use, mediated through visualizations and charts, sure. But she's hungry for interpretation. And that's what I hear the call for here, that I think begins to help me have some motivation to enter into digital humanities. Across this article that I called out for you today, Drucker hopes for and calls for new opportunities that make interpretation more foregrounded in the act of reading. Such work, she writes, quote, builds on demonstrable principles. To get an active interpretation that's really embedded in reading as opposed to processing, you've got to get multiple points of view. You've got to have co-relatable displays. You've got to have aggregated data. You've got to have social mediation and networking. Now here's where maybe we're coming back out again and it starts to sound strange, because what she's calling for is that maybe the way to get more interpretation is to employ some of her technologies to help us get some better basis of interpretation, which is a really interesting place. Shades of the ecological debate here, right? But it's one that I buy. I think that there's a way here in which she's calling for an approach to digital humanities as a hunger for more opportunities for interpretation, and that there's a lot of different capacities and possibilities in which that could happen, namely through play. So I want to end here with a word about play, which is what Drucker is calling for. She's faced here And we're faced here with possibilities of DH's set of reconfigurable parts. And especially in the context of our contemporary consumer electronics and the sort of media ecosystems we're part of, I think there's a real good reason to look at the history of human factors and the history of DH together. But I think the sort of histories I've called out here today demonstrate that the social institutional reconfigurations and the interface innovation have long been partners before, so it's not the first time. Appeals to materiality in the work of Suchman or Drucker or others in DH certainly bear the marks of feminist epistemologies, as well as science studies and post-colonial theory, but the push for more emphasis on orality, performance, and play in this work is also a push away from letting our possibilities be too determined by these modular protocols. So in the context of digital humanities and of this talk, I think to call for play in the field of DH is to invite a lot of reflective trial and error work rather than research and development work. Playful scholarship doesn't necessarily set out to map all the possibilities and contingencies that could happen and test them, but it's a way of just poking in different ways, trying to find different ways in without expectation of ever receiving the same results twice. It's a kind of research that's quite different from some of the research we might see most celebrate on this campus. It's research that expects contingency, expects accident. And to play the digital humanities, rather than to use them, I mean to shift the question here from a question of what can I do with DH to what can I do to create more opportunities for interpretation in the world. I want to close with a quote from Beth Nabisky, who she and I have had some great exchange over some of these ideas, and she's writing about play here between a couple paragraphs in a way that are trying to help us not miss how the new technologies actually help us get to these spaces of interpretation through play. So Beth writes, repositioning closed mechanical or computational operations as participatory or playful requires what economist and game theorist Martin Shubik called an explicit consideration of the role of the rules. This is an algorithmic literacy that's required. The consciousness of the existence and the agency of the rule set that was, for Shubik in 1972, a key factor in defining something as a game, rather than as perhaps a calamity or a condition, a plight. This is a very highly privileged position, Beth writes, to have the knowledge and real and perceived agency to play within and against the rules of these modular systems. And fostering that kind of knowledge and agency for play among our citizenry or our students, extending that privilege is a primary aim of the liberal arts education. Beth writes, this seems an entirely uncontroversial statement to make when applied to the understanding of aesthetics of our systems of policy and law. So why do we shy away from teaching formal, procedural, computational, or algorithmic thinking in the humanities classroom as somehow separate from humanistic concerns? Why do we allow it to be bifurcated from our own fields as STEM learning, and even set ourselves in opposition to it? She writes, maybe this is a failure of collective imagination and a failure of our obligations to our students. So as we start to push away from some of these techniques that we might think are pushing us away from active interpretation, maybe we can look at why interpretation is falling off that picture. And maybe it's not the technologies as much as the potentials presented through those technologies from those histories that we need to contend with. Because, am I ending Beth? No, one more piece of Beth. She says, if you understand the basic principles on which a piece of computer code is constructed and has to act, if you're aware that you're playing with it and the most constraining algorithm or any hermeneutic system, then this becomes another hermeneutic in the process. That system opens itself up to scholarly interpretation if you know how to play it. It opens itself up to subjective or artistic response if you know it enough to play with it. And it opens its way up to practical enhancement or countering measures. And in that way, she writes, it opens itself up to resistance. So that's where I wanted to end here. I thought Beth's call for play was a really good space to end here. And partly because I think she's not being naive to the fact that not everybody feels able to play. She's not trying to push away from technology to find that play. She's trying to find it in it, and it also calls for some real education and learning to know how to do it. So hopefully my deep T is useful, and if not, at least my broad initial introduction here was useful. Again, there's many other histories we could call into the room here, but I thought for this series, it would just be good to look at some of the genealogies that present us with the set of possibilities we have today. So I'm going to end there, and I think we got a while for some discussion here, right, Susan? So yeah, thanks. Let's get some discussion. And thankfully, we've got a lot of people in here who've worked more than I have in this area, and who've thought more than I have in this area. So I'm hopeful we get some really good retorts, clarifications, and corrections of those possibilities. So does anybody have any questions or initial observations that they'd like to start with? Yes.
So I have two questions. The first one is, can you talk a little bit more about the phrase human factors? Because I know both of those words, but you're using them together in a way that I think might get my mind around.
Yep.
And the second one is about the director readings. She seems very skeptical, or at least concerned about the possibility that humanists are relying on tools developed by disciplines whose epistemic underpinnings might be hostile to humanistic inquiry. And so she calls for humanist computer languages and humanist interfaces. I got her point that like we should be thinking in terms of ambiguity but not precision. But I couldn't, and this could just be a failure of imagination, but I couldn't actually imagine one. Like, what would that be? Like, what would the humanist interface be? I understand, like, ethically I understand what it is, but in terms of an actual tool, I couldn't imagine. Once again, it could be a failure of imagination.
So the human factors is a particular terminology that came out of aviation psychology and engineering work. It's very interesting. This was a pretty big campus for human factors for many years. It was part of our aviation institute. Did you know we used to have an aviation institute? We still do? Still do? All right, barely. Interestingly, I just saw in my life as an administrator that MS in human factors is one of the sunsetted degrees that are no longer offered, and I think it's notable because perhaps it's been absorbed in some other things, but the factors are the understanding of those affordances, right? So how many different colors can an operator distinguish in a high-stress condition is a basic human factors question for the design of indicator lights in a control panel for the purposes of critical operational processes. But again, the formulas they developed there to answer that question are the same ones that are still used in the design of our keyboards and interfaces. Now, on the humanistic interface, and this is the question that I so thankfully be working on with others in this room regularly. I think the question of what would a humanistic interface would be. I didn't hear Drucker as going against precision per se, but looking instead at asking the question of what epistemologies do these tools bring. So she's really leaning hard there, I think, on science studies and on the understanding that tools already bring a kind of hermeneutic with them at times, right? So you're looking for some hard examples here, and I'm in theory land today. So a hard example of a humanistic interface that is invented as opposed to borrowed from another discipline is kind of what I hear you asking here.
Well, that seemed to be, that call seemed to get the heart of both articles.
I think that at the moment, where I come at that is going to be coming more from the performance and aesthetic artistic side. So the idea of what would it be to be discovering something about a data set with your body by the way you move through a space, or by the way you sing the song as you're walking along and learning the landscape as you're singing it, to use some much older traditions here. But there's ways of discovering knowledge through human action that pretty much all the arts are doing all the time. And so I think we could probably maybe look more to those spaces in that case. Tanya Perez-Bustos was here last year, and I think some of the folks might be here that were at that talk. And she brought this great anthropological study of knitting and the understanding of how particular knitting patterns start to get passed from one person to the next in a way that can't be abstracted into a formula, but which have to be shown. There's a way in which she was studying the way a knitter would say, if you asked her as an anthropologist, how do you do that? You couldn't go in like the human factors folks and say, okay, it's this much up and this way down. She just said, I'll show you. And she started to look at that as even, I a kind of inspiration for the way we might transfer knowledge in a humanistic space of some kind, and the way that performance can be engineered. So, I think others could answer this question better than I could. What have some of my other colleagues here answered about? When you think of, I might single out Sharon or Anita, if you think about, or Harriet, like what are some of these, what would be an example of a humanistic interface that you think might answer this kind of call? Right, this is what some folks are looking to for something from Scalar, right? So Scalar is this platform that came out of digital humanities communities. Scalar is a web-based authoring platform, SCALAR, that's meant to facilitate writing in a way that lets you write in a hypertextual mode, that lets you do a lot of annotations, that lets you share those annotations. It's kind of, in one way, fulfilling a kind of dream that's in that Apple video in terms of linking different critical and hermeneutic moments. But I think that what they're really trying to do is allow it to happen in a way that promotes a lot of reflection through the multiple users they built into it. So there's a possibility for you to let others in, not to see every piece of it, but only one piece of it for review. And so we're trying to build an alternative peer review system into an authoring system in a way that comes to take its inspiration from an in-person conversation. So, yeah, Anita?
I'm guessing, that Harriet and Sharon have really smart things to add to this too. But here's maybe one example of thinking through how to sort of negotiate or narrate the notion of the development of a kind of humanistic design. And you kind of think of these things in conversation and not as sort of, a one-off, as in like you design it and that's it, and that's a humanistic design, because we all, those of us in the room all know that the contours and the parameters and boundaries of what is human is a very porous thing. And so just taking an example from our own campus, so thinking about Plato, for instance, and what it meant to even the educational computing platform, the first educational computing platform that was really deployed on any kind of multi-user scale. So the history of MOOCs has a really interesting kind of nugget. For however polemical the development of MOOCs are, there's an interesting kind of anchor onto the history of our own campus. So Plato was celebrated for lots of different things, plasma screens, lots of different hardware designs. The thing that it's celebrated for, if you can kind of look at it from the underbelly, is the way that a lot of the design elements were not actually sort of necessarily engineering focused, but came out as anticipated designs from the ground up. So precisely because lots of students were actually able to start to delve out and build out different kinds of functions, like using the kind of multi-user capacity. So people talk about it as being, the first platform was email, multi-user chat, sci-fi networks, online community before VPN, before the well, before Usenet. And just to kind of imagine what it meant to think about computing at the time of Plato's emergence as going from sort of traditional users to a kind of multi-user sort of scale. Wasn't it itself at the time a kind of humanistic interface-ish kind of development? Because it required thinking about your user as not experts and programmers and sort of grown-up scientists and people with real resources who thought of themselves as sort of having one-on-one relationships with this kind of thing, but required actually thinking about end users as being potentially, students, high school students, people without kinds of necessarily big sorts of archives and expertise. It's almost like thinking about, like, can you imagine, it was, in some ways, it's radical as thinking about, like, what would it mean to design a car that a child could use? No one would think about that, but at the time, right, and like computers were expensive things, not something that you would let just any old high schooler or undergraduate dabble on for sure, unless you have some disposable, $1 million, not quite $1 million a minute, but very expensive stuff nonetheless. So it was toward that, which is not to say obviously by any means that Plato was in and of itself fully a kind of humanist design, but to think about design as processes and to kind of think about them as alongside kind of a continuum. So one kind of build out.
Another directions or questions? Yeah, Michael.
So the last point about play,
Yeah.
very interesting. Firstly, because in a lot of work on doing design as an engineering practice, design things, and all of that idea of consultancy, they're very big on play. Play is the way. When you're stuck and you think there's no way around, you then ask these bizarre questions and look at the problem from another direction. So I think it's got a lot of power, but then it contrasts with one of your earlier slides about, say, what's your research question? Well, maybe I haven't got one yet. Maybe I'm still playing with it. So there's a playing with your data that I think is a critical thing to do. And I think that if your technology is forcing you to a very rigid, linear, Tayloristic, when you talk about plug and chug, you've got this sort of mechanism, they're going through it, you control that experiment, you collect your data automatically, it's directed to SPSS, a load of numbers come out, you can basically press a button and the paper writes itself. And it's like, well, yeah, you can do it, but they're just tedious papers. There's other thing is where you take something and see where it leads you. The other weird thing about the word play in English is it has several meanings. So there's, playing around, as children play, which of course, if you watch children play, can be very, very serious. So, there's different meanings of that playfulness. But you've also got play as in skilled performance with a musical instrument. And then you've also got the engineering sense of this bridge has a lot of play in it, waggle room. And I think, that using those three definitions, and maybe more, can itself be a playful heuristic for looking at a problem three different ways simultaneously. And I think, for me, the question is, do the technologies enable me to be playful, or are the technologies forcing me onto a conveyor belt like Charlie Chaplin's little research could go around?
And where Beth was really pushing play in her response to me was this idea that sometimes when confronted with systems that have constraints, the only way we're taught to see potential for liberation or agency is to work against and the constraints or get to depart altogether, sort of throw them off. And that's the sort of central narrative of a lot of consumer electronics, is that we have a less constrained version of the last software environment you're in, and now because you have less constraints, you can be more actualized. And I think the play in Beth's frame is about life with constraints in a way that isn't being determined by those constraints. And it's a way of facilitating multiple paths in as opposed to instead of a smooth path through. It's kind of the way I see her talking about that and interpret a bit too. Yeah, there's people who thought a lot about this a lot more than me, Lori too. She's a phenomenologist and an artist as well. But I think play requires as much care and caution as any of these other reading hermeneutics that we looked at would call for. But for me, it's a good place to go towards interpretation, to go towards producing more opportunities for interpretation and using new technologies to that end. Ted, how do you Ted Underwood works with a lot of big data sets.
Yeah.
And do you play with your data at the first
Yeah,
step?
absolutely. I mean, what I'm thinking about is once you've got the cover off the box, everything is playful, right? Because you're moving things around, and basically, if you're making up your plan as you go along, it all feels playful. And in fact, what's been fun for me about digital humanities is precisely that it feels much more open-ended and playful than humanities scholarship did for me, 10 years ago. But I think it's really hard getting, as you said in quoting Bethany's piece, it's important that she remembers that it's not necessarily easy to be there. That's not automatic.
Yeah.
You have to take some things off before you get to that point.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're outside the interface, which is a different sort of role.
Yeah.
So
I really embraced your metaphor of the reality of the interface, and I really kind of ran with it in my own mind, looking back as a book is an interface, a play is an interface, a theatrical performance, a musical instrument is an interface, and then looking into the future. And I think we have humanistic interfaces that are popular on our smartphones, they're called apps, some of them, that let you play and do things. I mean, the smartphone, you know, it's an interface that's been designed now, it's touchscreen, and it connects you with the Library of Alexandria and anything. And so I think it's a proliferation of interfaces now. We live in a world where, and one of the thoughts that, question for you, I think these if you look at it, interface that way, which has this scientific and industrial and work connection, that also has this humanities play and theater and interpretive angle. There's a point at which they become habituated. We don't think of a book as an interface anymore, but it is. And I'm just wondering, is that something you're thinking of the readings that as interfaces become habituated to interfaces, they become natural? And then I guess the last question, the DH presents this opportunity to play and creation in that old hippie spirit of, you know, two people to get together and create an interface, as opposed to you have to have a revolution and take over the industrial complex and create an interface.
The key piece here is fluency, and the role of fluency in the design of the system. So I think some of the systems that we inherit from human factors are designed for one arc of adoption, which is you learn it until you're, unlike a violin or unlike a sport, you would learn this interface better and better and better and better until it's invisible, and it's never visible again to you until it breaks. So that is not a phenomenology that is about rediscovery or reorientation. Imagine designing software that actually was intentionally alienating to you at times in your life, the way that so many of our other objects and processes are. There was an art project for a while that we can't run anymore, called, it was a version of Adobe Illustrator, the drawing app that was called Auto Illustrator, and it would just randomly, the icons would change every now and then. And like, so you learn how to use it, and then you'd have to relearn how to use it, and then you go back the other way. And I mean, that's what I'm used to from books. I mean, because a book, I understand it, and it's an interface that I understand, and then I read that text, and I read that text, and I realize this is not the same text I thought it was, because I read it anew. And I think it's that kind of modulation of fluency that I'm hungry for more in these reading interpretive practices, and I don't see enough of it in the software side of things. I think you can't get there unless you become an expert about some of these software pieces to really get to that point with some of these things. You know. This has been, just for a little more context here, those of you who might be new to thinking about digital humanities, this is a topic that campuses like ours just keep coming up against. Like, why don't we have a digital humanities center? Or if you want to be in digital humanities, should you be in English or history or something else? Or these kind of questions come up, and even at the top, top kind of administrative structural level, digital humanities now have some legibility for folks who are steering resources, even in a time of scarcity, to try to decide how we can get, as an institution, on maps people want to be on. So this is why this issue has some urgency, is that we need to be able to have some relationship to this, to be able to answer these things, and we have been. It's been, I want to call out some things. So we have one of our campuses, on our campus is one of the founding nodes of FemTechNet, and Sharon and Veronica from FemTechNet are in the back here and have been building this alternative network that's, instead of MOOCs, is making docs, distributed online open cooperative. So they're trying to find other ways through this, right? And we've got, every now and then we have a digital humanities scholar that comes, IPRH brings somebody, we get a great new head of the library like we have, and John Wilkin. We get some opportunities for discussion again on this campus about where's digital humanities here? And I'm kind of glad we can still have that conversation that hasn't been settled for us yet, because other places it's quite settled through a center, and I think we need to kind of keep figuring out what our relationship is to that as a community through opportunities like these. So I would just call out, IPRH is still bringing in speakers to kind of prod these things. I think those have been some of the most useful occasions for our campus discussions. It's just coming to hear Kathleen Fitzpatrick come talk about the end of the monograph in very formative terms, and us all arguing about it and figuring out where we are on that. And that's the place to get engaged with this. If the rest feels like too much for fitting into the rest of your scholarly lives. I think we're going to see some really interesting new things out of the library really soon here. There's this big new Mellon grant that is going to be leading some new forms of publications coming out of the library, some of which will be very interactive, some of which will just be PDFs, but not out of the scholarly press, or the library instead. So it's an interesting place to be for this right now. So why don't we end there, and I want to thank Susan for including me and inviting me to be part of the series. This is a really great series. I hope that Nina keeps going with this and finds a way to get these kind of intersectional conversations. And if you're looking for more conversation or to find your way through the network of our decentered digital humanities network on this campus, a lot of them are in here tonight. So ask for help, and we can point you to some people that kind of get started. So thanks again for coming out tonight.